Welcome back to two new creepypastas. I hope you enjoy it. The House on Harper's Hill. The house on Harper's Hill had stood abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its paint peeling, and its roof sagging with the weight of years gone by. It was a place that local children dared each other to enter, and where the bravest adults only whispered of strange occurrences. Legends swirled around it like the mist that often settled on the hilltop, but no one could quite agree on what had really happened there. When Sarah and her husband Tom inherited the old house from Tom's estranged uncle, they were intrigued more than anything. They had been looking for a change, a place to start fresh away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Tom had fond, albeit hazy, memories of visiting his uncle as a child, but he had never explored the house in its entirety. Sarah, an artist, saw potential in the decaying structure. She imagined turning it into a studio, a place of inspiration. They moved in on a crisp autumn day, their car loaded with boxes and their hearts full of optimism. The first few days were spent cleaning and unpacking. Sarah set up her art supplies in a room with large windows that overlooked the forest. Tom busied himself with repairs, starting with the roof and working his way down. It wasn't long before the oddities began. At first, it was just small things, a misplaced tool, a door creaking open on its own. They laughed it off, attributing it to the house settling or their own forgetfulness. But as the days passed, the occurrences grew more unsettling. One evening, Sarah was painting in her studio when she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned to see a shadow dart across the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she investigated, the hallway was empty. Shaking her head, she returned to her easel, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Tom, too, began experiencing strange events. He would hear footsteps above him when he knew Sarah was outside, or he would find tools he had just used gone missing, only to reappear in completely different rooms. One night, he swore he heard a whisper, soft and unintelligible, coming from the attic. He dismissed it, blaming the wind and his overactive imagination. A week after they moved in, Sarah found a small, locked door in the basement. It was hidden behind a stack of old boxes and covered in cobwebs. Curiosity piqued. She called Tom, and together they forced the door open. Behind it was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. With a sense of foreboding, they ventured down, their flashlight beams cutting through the thick dust. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small room, its walls lined with shelves. The shelves held old books, strange artifacts, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a table with a large, ornate book resting on it. The book was bound in cracked leather, its cover adorned with symbols neither of them recognized. Tom reached out to open the book, but as soon as his fingers touched the cover, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights. They stood in darkness, hearts pounding, until the wind died down and their lights flickered back to life. They left the basement quickly, deciding to lock the door and leave it be. That night, Sarah had a nightmare. She dreamt of the room in the basement, but it was no longer empty. Figures cloaked in shadow surrounded the table, chanting in a language she couldn't understand. The book was open, and from its pages, a black mist poured forth, enveloping the room and reaching out towards her. She woke up screaming, her heart racing and her body drenched in sweat. Tom comforted her, but his own sleep was plagued by restless dreams. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house grew oppressive. They heard whispers in the walls, and shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Objects began to disappear, only to reappear in bizarre places. Sarah's paintings took on a darker tone, and she found herself unable to stop painting the same eerie figures she had seen in her dream. Desperate for answers, Tom decided to research the house's history. He discovered that his uncle had been part of a secret society that dabbled in the occult. They had used the house on Harper's Hill for their rituals, attempting to summon entities from beyond the veil. The room in the basement had been their gathering place, and the book their guide. The rituals had ceased abruptly after a member vanished without a trace, and the society disbanded soon after. Realizing the gravity of their situation, Tom and Sarah decided to leave the house. They packed their essentials and planned to stay with friends until they could sell the property. But on the night before they were set to leave, the house had other plans. The power went out, plunging them into darkness. They huddled together, using candles for light, but the shadows seemed to dance around them, growing thicker and more oppressive. The temperature dropped, and they could see their breath misting in the air. Then came the whispers, louder and more insistent. They echoed through the halls, a cacophony of voices speaking in that same unearthly language. The doors and windows slammed shut, trapping them inside. The floorboards creaked under invisible footsteps, and the walls seemed to close in on them. In a panic, they fled to the basement, hoping to find some way out through the small windows. But as they descended the stairs, they saw that the door to the hidden room was wide open. The book lay on the table, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. A dark figure stood over it, turning the pages with skeletal fingers. The figure turned to face them, and they saw not a face, but a void, a swirling mass of darkness. It reached out, and the room was filled with an unbearable cold. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, and the shadows engulfed them. When the neighbors realized they hadn't seen Tom and Sarah in days, they called the police. The officers who entered the house found it empty, the air heavy with an unexplainable chill. The basement door was locked, and when they finally broke it open, they found the room exactly as Tom and Sarah had left it, except for the book, which was gone. The house on Harper's Hill remains abandoned to this day, a place of mystery and fear. Locals still talk of the young couple who disappeared and of the strange occurrences that continue to plague the old house. And sometimes, on a quiet night, if you stand on the hill and listen carefully, you can hear the whispers of those who came before, calling out from beyond the veil. The reflection. It all started when Jake moved into his new apartment. It was a charming, old place with large windows, creaky floors, and a peculiar charm that only buildings with history seemed to possess. He loved the high ceilings and the antique fixtures, but what drew him in the most was the massive mirror in the living room. The landlord mentioned it was an original feature of the apartment, almost a century old. Jake, a lover of vintage things, found it mesmerizing. As the days went by, Jake started to notice strange occurrences. It began with subtle things, misplaced objects, doors ajar that he swore he had closed, and a persistent feeling of being watched. He brushed it off as the quirks of an old building combined with his overactive imagination. One evening, after a long day at work, Jake collapsed onto his couch and stared at the mirror. As he looked at his reflection, something felt off. The room behind him seemed darker, and his reflection seemed to move out of sync with his own movements. Reflection appeared slightly delayed, as if it was lagging behind his movements. He waved his hand experimentally, and sure enough, there was a split-second delay before his reflection mimicked him. He laughed it off, attributing it to his tired eyes and poor lighting. But the feeling of unease lingered. One night, he woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat. The room was cold, unnaturally cold. He heard a faint whispering, like the sound of a distant conversation, but he was alone. His eyes darted to the mirror. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he saw his reflection sitting up, staring back at him. Only it wasn't just a reflection. It was him, but not him. The eyes were different, darker, almost malevolent. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light, but the reflection remained, its lips curling into a sinister smile. Panic surged through him as the reflection stood up and started to walk towards the glass, its movements deliberate and slow. Jake was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear, unable to tear his gaze away. The reflection reached the surface of the mirror and placed its hand against the glass. Jake felt an icy chill spread through his body as if the cold fingers were touching him. The reflection's smile widened, and it mouthed words that Jake couldn't hear but felt deep within his bones. "I'm coming." With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Jake leapt from his bed and threw a sheet over the mirror, blocking out the eerie sight. He spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, lights on, praying for morning. When dawn finally broke, Jake ripped the mirror from the wall and smashed it into pieces. He moved out of the apartment that very day, leaving the shards behind. But the feeling of being watched never left him. Years later, long after he had moved to a new city and tried to forget, he couldn't escape the unease. Mirrors still made him uncomfortable, and he avoided them as much as possible. One evening, as he was brushing his teeth in his new modern bathroom, he glanced up briefly. There, in the reflection, stood his old self, eyes dark and malevolent, whispering with a grin, "I found you. Thank you for watching. Have a good night of sleep and stay safe. Please consider subscribing. It is completely free."